We want you to have more information to improve the quality of what you do there. So it sounds kind of ambitious for a 3-hour training, but I think I will move through it pretty quickly. Because I will move through it pretty quickly, if I'm going past a point and you haven't got a handle on it, make sure you ask a question. If you aren't getting it, I'm sure there's at least 5 other people in the room that are equally not getting it. And that's usually my fault for not explaining it in detail. I will warn you, just a little tad of warning. Most people, when they ask a question, are looking for 2 or 3 words like yes, no, maybe, or maybe a sentence, and I tend to answer questions with essays. So if you have got your answer, you can do this. Nobody will see it but me, and I will say, okay, they've got their answer, and I can move on. All right. So you're all pretty familiar with the ACE studies, right? I'm not going to have you all raise your hand because I'm going to just review it really quickly. The ACE studies is an interesting piece of research. It started in the late 80s, and the chief medical officer for the Kaiser Permanente Central California division was Vince Folletti. And they had a number of programs, and one that in particular was really very beneficial to people in reducing the symptoms of chronic illness. And it was a weight loss program. And what they were dealing with is people that were morbidly obese, not so much the obesity itself, but they were looking at kind of stabilizing all of those health-related risks and dealing with things like heart disease and diabetes and a number of other ailments. Well, they had a significant number of people that achieved the goal of health and then relapsed and went back to not only where they were before, but exceeded it significantly, and many of them began to die. And they were considering that a treatment failure. And so they began to trying to figure out why it is that this is so. Why this is a problem for people. Why is it that they have difficulty, changing a lifestyle? And they really were looking quite broadly. They developed a structured interview format so they could interview the different people and kind of collect some data. It wasn't going anywhere. In almost a year of collected data, they hadn't gone anywhere. But Vince was tireless in this. And as most people that are kind of on a mission, and I'm sure you experience this sometimes yourselves, you have one of those weeks where you run out of energy before you run out of week. You had those weeks? He was having one of those weeks. And so he knew these questions really well, and what he did accidentally is sandwiched 3 questions together. And it opened the door for this study. And his question was, because they were dealing with all sorts of weight-related things, how much did you weigh at your first sexual experience? And the woman began to cry, and she said 40 pounds, and she began to reveal a history of incest. And he was instantly alert and awake. And they began to shift their thought process. Well, maybe this isn't about current life choices. Maybe this is an adaptive process that went on early in life, and they're still kind of carrying it on. And so they redeveloped their process and started asking questions. And the initial numbers they were collecting were in 18 different categories. And those initial numbers were very powerful statistically. So Vince Folletti approached Robert Andes, who was one of the leads epidemiologists at the CDC, and they formulated this study, reducing the elements to 10, and began to actually collect data. The original study collected 17,327 data sets from participants. For those of you that like stats, that is a really good N. If you're not a statistician, my N thing just doesn't mean anything to you. When I present to grad students, I can tell N-related jokes and people get them, but in the real world, nobody else gets that kind of joke. So what they did is they found these 10 things were impactful in people's lives 50 years plus after they occurred. So these were the elements. Physiological abuse by a parent or caregiver, psychological abuse by a parent or caregiver, physical abuse by a parent or caregiver, sexual abuse or exploitation, physical abusive behavior, neglect, abandonment, emotional neglect. They found that you didn't have to be addicted to a substance, but having it abused in the home was problematic. Was there any mental illness? Even at this point, when they started this research, we really weren't talking in terms of postpartum, but as the research has moved forward, we are now including in mild mental illness even episodic postpartum depression. Because it has an impact on the development of the child. Domestic violence was looked at. Domestic violence included the normal things we think about with being, assaultive behavior, destruction of personal property, but they also broadened that category out to include things like intimidation to gain compliance. Now that's automatically a problem for us because that's the single most favorite parenting strategy on the face of the planet. How many of you, in your moments of being upset, have threatened a child to get them to comply? If you haven't, pat yourself on the back. You are about 3% of the population. And then having an absent parent or caregiver. So this is what they call a structural equation model, which you really don't care about. But what you're looking at is how much each of these contributes to the overall outcome. And what they found is it really didn't matter which 4 you had, but if you had 4 or more, you generally fell into the category of having chronic health or mental health issues. So of the original research of that 17,327, they found 16% had 4 or more of those elements, and that 16% accounted for 90% of the people that presented with chronic illness. What does that mean? If you're dealing with chronic illness, or you're dealing with people that are seeking mental health services, you more than likely are dealing with at least 4 of these in the history of a person, whether they've disclosed them or not. And what they found is that the higher the number, the more exacerbated the symptoms of that chronic illness can become. The problem with this initial study, now it's been duplicated now to over 660,000 people. That's even a better end, by the way. But the original study was that 74% were college graduates, that most were, I think it was 71% were employed in middle management jobs, so they had good jobs, they were very stable. Most were white. This was what we would consider kind of mainstream, no fringes, no marginalized population, and this is what we're seeing. And as we've continued to collect data, what we found is segments of the culture that have more pressure, more challenge, tend to have more of these expressed. Does that surprise anybody? If you don't have regular food and regular shelter, if you're not getting adequate education, if you don't have adequate health care, if you don't have, both parents, if you don't have, if you don't live in a stable community, what we do is up the ante on these. Does that make sense? So a lot of the things that you deal with clinically, if you're in the mental health world, whether that is a therapist or as a support person, or you're dealing with in, for example, a foster adoptive parent situation, is you're dealing with people that have early in life had many of their primary systems fundamentally altered. Because that's what the findings from the ACE study started us looking at. They've been fundamentally altered. And the alterations don't go away generally simply because the behavior that generates it stops. Did you catch what I just said there? That's an important point to catch. In other words, once the alteration happens, ta-da, done deal. What we can do at that point is help people mediate that change, but we can't undo it. Does that make sense? All right. So some of the core concepts of the ACE study, which makes treating particularly children difficult, is that each child has a unique history based on their own experiences. And when we say that, we're not just talking about the neighborhood they lived in, the family that they had, but we're also talking physiologically, they've had a tremendously different experience than any other person on the face of the planet. And that physiologically different experience generates patterns and adaptions that are unique to them. So that becomes kind of an important piece of this. If you're interested in more of this kind, the core concepts kind of idea, the Harvard Child Development Center has what they call their 10 core concepts. If you were to go there to receive services from them, you have to be educated in their 10 concepts. But they're available online, and they're easy to understand, and they make a lot of sense. Particularly in children, the way they learn to regulate their emotions, their behavior, is not from instruction. Did you hear what I just said? They don't learn it from instruction. Everybody wants to teach and instruct, but they don't primarily learn that from instruction. They learn it in, if you will, on a canvas of relationship. The quality of the relationship will allow whoever's in that relationship to provide modeling, and the modeling is always more powerful than the instruction. So if you are working with a child that is having tantrums at home, you probably need to understand what that environment is like and how tantrums are being initiated, sustained, and who else is having them. Now, frequently, let me kind of pull it out of the home for a second and put it in schools. Anybody here work in schools? Nobody's going to raise their hand for that? Okay. If you have a 40-year-old teacher having a power struggle with an 8-year-old child, it is not the child. Can you kind of go with that on me? I don't care how poor the behavior of the child is, it's not primarily the child's problem. It's the design and maintenance of the environment by the person that's in charge. So that when we start looking at trauma, a lot of times we have to look at the environment in which people are operating in and how it might be activating what's going on in their life. That human development is messy, incongruent, unpredictable. You kind of got that part, right? Okay. So everyone here is the product of your own history. You are who you are today because of your history. When you're working with people in the mental health field or in medical field, and you don't understand why they're behaving the way they are, think this. They are who they are today because of their history. Just as you are who you are because of your history. It doesn't give us any advantage to judge, to criticize, to really put negative labels on their behavior, because their behavior is generated by their history, just like your behavior is generated by your history. What you can argue with is they probably should have had a better history, but too bad they didn't have one, so now we're going to work with helping them mediate it. Another core concept is that when relationships get weakened, the ability to regulate is sacrificed. And we're going to talk about the physiology behind that. When relationships are weakened, it is difficult for anybody to regulate themselves. The younger the person is, the more difficult that becomes. How many of you have been in relationships that have come apart? How difficult was it for you to look at that person and feel connected and loving and warm and encouraging and nurturing to that person when it was in that process of the relationship coming apart? Anybody have a good skill at doing that? Or did you find that as the relationship became increasingly compromised, you were less patient, more angry, more upset, more aggressive, more hostile? Is that more your experience? So what that tells us is you really are human, because that's exactly the right human experience people should have. So why are the adversive experiences in childhood destructive to health and happiness of individuals as well as families? Primarily because of the adaptions that go on because of it. Because the adaptions occur, and we're going to go through where the adaptions occur, but they occur at multiple levels that have impact on somebody's life in a number of ways that are kind of unpleasant. Now, not all adaptions are unfortunate. Some are really handy. But the handy ones tend to be only handy in certain circumstances. So let me give you a really easy one to kind of get a handle on before I move into the next section. Let's say that you are being raised in a highly chaotic environment. And the way you deal with it and feel safe is you begin to organize your world. You might even become a compulsive list person, where you have lists for your lists. Now, I'm not going to ask for hands, but I find a lot of people in mental health have lists with lists and are chronic organizers. But you think about how adaptive that can be to help you feel safe, feel secure, allow you to cope with chaos. Where it becomes unfortunate is it gets generalized because you're dealing with an immature, developing person. It gets generalized to lots of other things. How many of you have met somebody that's very controlling in a relationship? How many of you know somebody that the way that they show love is trying to organize you? That's a problem. So the same adaptation can have both positive and negative consequences. The problem is that the consequence that's generated out of the relief is always going to be the dominant. Do you understand what I mean by that? If planning and organizing helps me deal with the chaos, then I'm going to persist in using it even though my friends don't like being organized. Why? Because it relieves the more distressing activator. Does that help? All right. So let's talk a little bit about the process. When we talk about the ACE studies, we're talking about environments that create change. We call that in the concept of traumagensis, how trauma is being created and maintained. So I'm going to introduce kind of an idea that we're going to shift trauma away from an event to an activation of the physiological system. So what creates trauma the most effectively is when the threat-stress response system is repeatedly activated. And I'll kind of go through the mechanics of that soon. When the nervous system becomes chronically overactivated because that threat-stress response system is just cooking all the time, then it forces the physical systems, the nervous system, even the biology, to begin to shift to accommodate that state of over-arousal. We also know that activation doesn't require awful events. In other words, we do not need to have someone sexually abused or physically assaulted or starve in order to generate symptoms. All we need is a history of having that threat response system activated over and over and over again. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a second. That most of the things that we deal with that generate the lion's share of referrals in mental health, for example, problem behavior, are exactly correct physiological responses to reactive adaptation. Now, that doesn't mean they're moral, it doesn't mean they're legal, it doesn't mean that they're pleasant to be around, but physiologically, they are correct. Now, the problem is that they annoy the hell out of people, and people want them to go away. But the reality is that many of those behaviors are exactly correct physiological responses to having an activated threat response system. So let me kind of walk you through some of this and make sense of it. I'm going to kind of broaden your view of trauma a little bit. Most people tend to think of trauma as being associated with an event of some kind. Natural disaster, death of a loved one, witnessing a violent act, being the recipient of a violent act. And while those are all true, they aren't enough. So let me kind of walk you through this. What we know is immediately forces the physiology to adapt. In other words, it's an event of such magnitude that it forces the physiology to change right now. We call those episodic traumas or event-based traumas. Of all of the symptoms we see in most settings, this is an example of what those might be, DV, accidents, kind of things, military action, they account for about 20% of the overall symptoms. And it's the only trauma-related diagnosis we really have in the DSM, always is referring back to this form of trauma. So all of our trauma definitions, the way we look at it through the American Psychology Association, has to be event-related. That's very short-sighted. And they used to even talk about it, even up through the early 2000s, probably starting in the late 80s. They would talk about the big T versus the little t trauma. You remember being exposed to that? So let me kind of play with you a little bit. What's the demarcation point? When does something move from being the big to a small, or from a small to a big? There is no demarcation point. It's always been a continuum of experience. The big T versus little t is kind of like the heaven or hell discussion. How would you like to be the most righteous person in hell or the most wicked person in heaven? How do you measure that? You know, what's the point at which you move from one to the other? And it's a ridiculous thing that we have done in orchestrating trauma around this kind of division. Trauma is always based on a number of things. The individual's response physiologically, the vulnerability and resilience of the individual, the frequency at which they have been activated. So you can have people that have the same episode, and some are really disturbed by it, and some aren't. Does that make sense for this one? The next one I want to kind of expose you to is what we call low-intensity, high-frequency activations. This is where no single event is really all that awful, but there's enough of them that are awful enough to get your physiology cooking. So let me give you kind of an example of what that looks like. So you're looking at chaotic environments, highly aggressive environments, punitive environments, environments that have a lot of demand without adequate relationships, kind of like what we see in mental health clinics sometimes, a lot of pressure on people without an adequate relational support. Some of you have experienced that before. That begins to create symptoms in this perspective. Inconsistent childbearing practices, parenting by annoyance, instability in the family, all the major domains of that we look at for stability can generate more symptoms for us than an actual event. What we're looking at is most symptoms, about 70% that we see in a mental health setting, are generated from these low intensity, high frequency historical activations. So together, we're looking at Between the two forms of this, we're looking at about 90% of our symptoms that present. That's really problematic because of our over-focus on events, we tend to not look at the other. And this is done, in some respects, it's been done intentionally for a number of reasons. So let me kind of enumerate some of those and the politics that were involved in this grand decision. And some of you in your work day probably use the DSM. How many of you use the DSM on a pretty regular basis? Half a dozen, okay. Well, those of you who don't, you just can hang on to this for information. The DSM is a committee-derived activity by the American Psychological Association, whether they have committees for this that decide what is and what isn't a diagnosis. The problem is, fundamentally, that only 17% of all the diagnoses have any scientific research supporting them. 83%, and I don't care, I taught this in college for years. I was really happy when they went to from the 3 to the 4, because in the 3, only 10% of the DSM had any research to support it. So we were on the upswing. But I think we have a lot of diagnosis and labels, which it's a nosology, how we categorize disease, that has no proof. It is just the opinion of the committee. Now that's problematic enough, but then you add to that politics. In 1975, we had just less than 600 people petition the APA to remove homosexuality out of the DSM as a mental health disorder. I think that was a great call. However, it's reflective. It took less than 600 to get a thing taken out. We've had other things added in. We had the GAF, which we don't use now. The GAF was added in at the request of 1,100 people. So things have been added and taken out, usually by petition from the community of providers. So when they were rewriting the DSM-5, they had 33,704 people write in to request that developmental trauma disorder be included in the DSM, which is, we're talking about this 70% here. And guess who freaked out? Pharmaceutical companies, because there is no pharmacological protocols that work with this kind of trauma. Want to know who else freaked out? Psychiatrists, because you're going to force people to have more treatment, therapy treatment, and less being able to manage by medication. So in their wisdom, the infinite wisdom of the APA committees, they didn't put it in. And the insurance companies also were very, very clear that if you do this, you're going to make every single diagnosis a co-occurring disorder, and that will bankrupt us. So we don't have this diagnosis that would capture about 70% of the symptoms we see, because it would be economically disadvantageous to insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. I think that's a very poor reason not to have it. So as you're trying to figure out, how do I give people a diagnosis, because they have this list of symptoms, which we're kind of going to go over, but there's no diagnosis to hang that symptom in. So you have to kind of come up with what's the closest thing you can get to it. And that's a problem. But anyway, that's the fundamental piece of where we get most of our traumagenesis, is from either big events or low-level intensity with high frequency. Questions about what a high frequency might look like? How many of you have ever been around a family where everybody just has a really harsh startup to a conversation? They don't mean to be mean. It has that tonal quality. This is harsh. Everybody's harsh, and they all start. That is an activating enough environment to begin to generate symptoms. So when we start looking at it from this perspective, it really does broaden out what we're looking at a great deal. The final way we look at is low intensity, continual environmental or long duration. This would be those situations like you have a family member that becomes incapacitated, you become the long-term caregiver. We see a lot of trauma symptoms generated from that. Why? Well, it's not that any one day is particularly awful, but the pressure of it never lets up. And so it begins to generate symptoms as well. So the real key to understanding trauma is understanding what's going on in the physiological system. So let me kind of begin the process of kind of shifting your awareness a little bit. How many of you have burned your hand on something hot at some point in your life? Did you have to think about getting it out of the way? In fact, if you'd have said, well, let's see, what would be the right thing for me to do? Should I leave it in? Should I pull it out? How much damage would be? If you went through that rational, logical process, your hand would be burned off before you finally took some action. That system of emergency response is not designed to be logical, evaluative, or cognitive. It is designed to be 100% reactive. Not a little bit reactive. It is designed to be 100% reactive. So if you touch something hot, you're going to jerk your hand away. If you step off the curb in front of a speeding car, you're going to jump out of the way. If you have to think about it, you're going to go boom, boom, and that's going to be the end of you. Now let me kind of talk about the tremendous brain economy of this. So what happens? In order to access your executive functioning and think and make a cognitive decision, to begin the process of thinking and making a cognitive decision requires your brain between 100 and 150 milliseconds. Well, that's fast. We're talking about millionths of a second. Your threat stress response system, though, is activated between 9 and 10 milliseconds, which is faster. I can access that reactive system 10 times at least before I could access my cognitive system once. Is that a problem? Yes, it is a problem. If you're living in an environment where you're constantly activated, you should see very little rational behavior, very little planned intentional behavior, but you should see a lot of impulsive reactive behavior. Why? Because that's the system it's on. How many of you would sit in a room with the air conditioning on, turn to 40 and said, you know, it's just not warm in here, and yell at the room for not being warmer? Does that make any sense? We do the same thing to people all the time. Their thermostat, if you will, or the brain part that they're operating in is not capable of doing the things that we keep expecting them to do. And so we blame them for that. It's like the same thing. This room, I think it's the fault of this couch that this room is so cold. Well, get up and turn the heat on. Put it in a different place, and you will get what you want. We way too often try to get heat out of an air conditioning unit, if that is a good metaphor for you. So how many different ways do we begin to adapt the moment this system becomes compromised? Perceptually, neurobiologically, emotionally, cognitively, physically. Ready for some more? We even begin to change at the molecular level. We have an increased ability to be reactively adaptive, and we even begin to change genetically. All of this is going on the moment we exceed that threshold and activate this system that says you need to take some action right now. The more often it is on, the more problematic it is. Do we ever not want this system to work? Absolutely not. We need this system. Do we want it on too much? No. We don't. So let me kind of talk a little bit more about some of the dynamics here and why it's a problem. In the overwhelming episodic event where it's a big, big situation that's charging you up, your whole body, many parts of your body are releasing, if you will, a chemical cocktail. And that chemical cocktail is designed to help your body be prepared to react. Now, most people, after that initial activation, particularly big activation, you can get back into your cognitive thinking pretty well within an hour. You know, how many of you have had that situation that you've thought of exactly the perfect thing to say an hour later? Haven't you had those moments? That's because once your system calms down, you're able to think more rationally. The problem that we run into isn't that. The problem we run into is that when you have frequent activators, what we're doing is we're kind of butting into the upper limit of the person's ability to tolerate. And in the first thing, we know it's going to take 18 to 24 hours for the body to get back to baseline. Let's say you live in an environment where you're getting 8, 10, 12 activators a day. Your body never gets a chance to get back to baseline. That creates what we call a cumulative harm effect. And the cumulative harm effect is that it forces your whole physiology to begin to shift. If it persists long enough, you're going to develop a whole host of chronic conditions. Some of them are going to be medical. Some of them are going to be emotional, relational, psychological in nature. Questions about that before I move on? I know I'm moving through this pretty quickly, but I'm trying to get a lot of information in your hands before 4 o'clock rolls around. No questions, okay. So what I've just introduced to you is the idea that we're physiological aroused. It forces adaptions. Some of the adaptions can be positive or negative. The adaptions are impacting both the brain and the body. And one of the concepts we have to understand is that the individual is never existing alone. I like the way Bess will put it here. We don't exist as individuals. We are the products of each other. Yet over and over again, we try to treat people as if they're isolated from their environment. Don't we? We want to know what's wrong with them. Particularly if we're dealing with children, them is not the place to start. You're always looking environmentally. Now that makes some people really uncomfortable, particularly if they don't regulate themselves very well. Children need relationship to learn how to regulate themselves behaviorally and emotionally. If they don't get it developmentally, they're going to have a difficult time learning at other stages in their life. I did not say it's not possible. I just said it's difficult and challenging to learn it if you have to learn it intentionally rather than just learn it as part of your environment. So let me give you a comparison. How many of you were born in this room? You were all born, right? Anybody hatched? Okay, born. So you came out of the womb. Did your family hand you this dictionary-sized volume of family rules? Nope, nobody got that, right? You had to learn the rules by being in the environment, right? And you probably noticed at some point that the rules change based on what mood certain family members were in. Did you find that that was true? So you had to not only have the rule, but you had to understand the exceptions to the rule, when the rule was more important, when the rule was less important. So it wasn't just this rule. This is one of the, really, that creates a lot of chaos for people. That's a highly chaotic environment. If there isn't adequate relationship there to sustain a person, we're going to start seeing symptoms. Does that sound kind of unfortunate? You're saying, well, that's the way all people operate. Well, no, it's the way most people operate. it's not, we have a huge getting into relationships without a plan, having children without a plan, parenting without a plan, you know, partnering with somebody without a plan, and then we're surprised when it goes to the dung heap. And how do we know that it does that? Well, because half of marriages end in divorce. About 70% of cohabitations end in separation. This is, you know, this is not a good plan. Anybody been through a divorce, you realize, you know, that's not your A plan. That should be a B or D or C or, you know, J plan, not your A plan. But if you don't have a plan, that's the direction you're in. So what we do is we have children embedded in environments that are not structured well enough that they can learn to regulate themselves from that environment. Does that make sense? And we pull them out of those environments and we put them into other environments sometimes for their safety. And then we have, in the case of, for example, foster families, a lot of foster families want the child that's never had any of that relational regulation to operate in the way that their children do, who they have an adequate relationship with, or at least a more adequate relationship with, and then blame the child because they can't do that. You seeing a challenge with that? What they're asking isn't even neurologically, physiologically appropriate. They have control of the environment. They need to redesign the entire environment to support that child, not expect that child to do everything to adapt to them. It's back-asswards. Now, will foster agencies and licensing people tell you that? Hell no, because they're not going to take the risk that you might not want to be a foster parent if you have to change a lot. But I can guarantee you, get one of these kids that's grown up in a hot system, you're going to change a lot anyway. So you might as well know what you're doing. So let's talk about the particulars of this system. And I'm going to try as much as possible to stay away from jargony terms. It's a little hard because there are so many, but I'm going to try to simplify them in the easiest ways I possibly can for you. So we're going to talk about the stress threat response system, which is really simplified in its most basic. We're looking at two subsystems. One is the polyvagal system, and one is the anterior cingulate of the cortex. So I'm going to start with the ACC first. The ACC is what we call an environmental filter. Its job is to study the environment and assess what's relevant and what's irrelevant out there that can cause you harm, hurt, disappointment, danger, risk. That's its job. For all intents and purposes, it is your sensory system. It isn't designed to fight your battles, but it is designed to alarm you, send the alarm out so that you know that there is a danger here. Now, it does two really magnificent things. And remember, it's doing it in roughly 9 to 12 milliseconds. The first one that it does is it encodes your state memory. In other words, your entire physiological package and all your sensory input at this moment is recorded. Of course, it's not a cognitive recording, it's an implicit recording. It is a state memory. A state memory. State memory is everything to do with the state you're in. It's your physiology, it's what you're thinking and feeling, and you know, it would include all of your sensory input, smell, taste, touch, all of those things. It is your state memory. How many of you have walked into a place and felt immediately unsafe or dangerous there? Think of how efficient that is. You didn't have to think about it. Your whole body, as soon as there was something in the environment that triggered that state memory, your whole body was alert and ready to act. State memories are so much more efficient to protect people. What they do is, rather than remember how slow it is to think about something, if I have to access the thought process and think through my choice, I might be dead. But if I can activate my entire system with one simple little environmental activator, then I'm ready to go and I'm a lot safer. Well, therein is also part of the problem with trauma. So we're going to talk about how this gets kind of overly expanded. The other thing that this system does is it kicks in your survival system. Now, a lot of times people are used to thinking of survival system as being the fight, flight, or freeze. Can I ask permission to step on that a little bit? Let's start calling it what it really is. You have sympathetic responses and you have dorsal responses. And I'm going to go through and break them down. But that's essentially what we're going to see. So I'm going to go ahead and put these all up because you have them in front of you. What happens when the threat stress response system is activated way too often? This would be in the low intensity, high frequency activation. What's going to happen? The more you use a thing, the better you get at it, don't you? And if I'm using this system 8, 10, 12 times a day, I am building capacity in it, aren't I? The other piece that's kind of unfortunate is that my reaction speed actually increases. How many of you have worked with somebody that they're in the middle of something and they cannot tell you how they got there? So what do they tell themselves? Well, this is just instinctual. This is just who I am. This is just how it works. Because it's so fast now when they are activated that they're already into their adaptive behaviors before anything else can even catch up to that. The other thing that's kind of unfortunate is frequent activation of this system begins to erode our ability to weigh what's relevant and not relevant in the environment. How do you decide what's a risk? Let me give you a metaphor for this that you can kind of play with. So you have a category in your brain for flowers. But one time you're exposed to some exotic rose and it crashes you. You're in the hospital getting a shot. You're miserable for several days while you recover. It is an awful experience. Now you have exotic rose and flowers. Does it make sense? So time goes by and you find out that you have the same kind of reaction to chrysanthemums. And now you have roses and chrysanthemums and flowers. How many bad experiences more are you going to need before all flowers become dangerous? Not too many. That's what we see with a frequent activation of this system, is that neutral and sometimes even positive things, we train the brain to not be able to distinguish relevant differences in those. So where I might have originally seen this is a danger, this isn't, that isn't, that isn't, that isn't, that isn't, then maybe that is and that isn't. Because of the frequent activation, what we've done is that is, that is, that is, that is, that is, that is, and that's twice what it was, and this is bad too. So we become desensitized to the neutral and the positive. Because everything is shadowed with this view of being dangerous. How many of you have worked with somebody and you said, why can't they see that this could be really good for them? Because we have their brain trained not to look at that stuff. The only way to get them to look at that is to get them out of that threat-stress response system. The next thing that we see is that, yes ma'am, press your button there so you can, it should turn green. Press on the push. Down towards the bottom. Better yell loud.
Press down below.
How do you get them out of the stress? How do you get them out of the threat stress response?
So she's asking, how do we get people out of the stress response? The first and foremost effective way is by having a relationship with them that is safe and secure, and that the person's in charge of the environment, whether that's as a parent or if you're in other environments, the people in charge of that environment not getting in their own dysregulated reactive system. How many times have we seen people, they're dysregulated, they're in this threat, they're in their hot system, if you will, and they're trying to parent a child. Two people that are hot can't make one that's cool. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And yet, over and over again, we have primarily discipline invoked at the moment that the relationship is the most fragile. We go for punitive and control rather than relationship. Let me give you an example of this. And this is a clinical example, so I'll apologize. So I was doing a workshop for a group of grandparents raising their grandchildren, and we had like 180 people in the room. And one of the grandmothers, who's 75, and she's a kinship placement for her 7-year-old. Am I the one making these noises? For her 7-year-old granddaughter. The first time she'd ever met this granddaughter was at the exchange for the interstate compact between the state that she was in. So from birth to 5, she had been living with the mom, who was an active drug addict, lived on the streets, was an active prostitute. It was not a good environment for her. She gets taken into the child protective custody in the state that she was in. She was in that system for about 18 months until they located and made the illegal arrangements to get her moved to grandma. So grandma had her about 3 months. Grandma was having daily discussions with her about lying. 30, 45 minutes, several times a day, because this girl would lie. And she said, she's got to stop lying. She lies to everybody. She lies to me. She's just a liar. And it's, you know, she was so focused on the lying, and she kept doing more and more punitive things and punishing this child to stop the lying. She didn't know what else to do, so she was being hard-handed, punitive, aggressive, and even began to be kind of assaultive with this child to try to change this behavior. And she said, I don't know how to help her. Well, the first and foremost is rules come after relationship. Get the relationship in order first, then use the relationship to modify the behavior. You don't have a relationship with her. There's no way the punitive stuff is going to work. How many of you have had somebody, well-meaning, kind of confront you about something you've done? How many of you at that moment want to just wrap your arms around their neck, kiss them on the cheek, and say, thank you for directing me and improving my life? Or were you a little bit defensive? Well, that's kind of what she was doing. She just kept pushing this kid to be more and more dysregulated. So we said, you know she's lying. Quit making an issue. Go up, put your arm around her. Tell her you love her. You're glad that she lives with you. And that you two will get through this together. It's going to take some time, and you guys will work on it. But the most important thing is that she know that you're glad to have her with you. And Grandma said, I can't do that because she's still lying. And as long as you focus on that and are punitive, you're just going to drive this girl further and further away. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. You have to create an environment that isn't an activating environment if you're going to stabilize particularly traumatized children. The other piece that's kind of interesting that kind of annoys a lot of people, as the more energy I'm putting out here in this environment to study and not being able to make distinctions between relevant and irrelevant risk, so everything's kind of got that risky flavor to it, I have to put so much energy to that, I become somewhat disconnected from me. What's the consequence of that? I do not see myself as an active agent in whatever happens. In other words, I'm reacting to that world out there. I am not initiating in it. How many of you have struggled with people not being able to see that they're contributing to what they're getting? That is physiologically correct. It's annoying as hell, but it is physiologically correct that that's where they should be. And so a lot of times what that means is they are by nature kind of egocentric and self-centered. They're not empathic. The survival system is not an empathic system. The survival system is about me and what I need. It's not about anybody else I'm around. So trying to talk to somebody that's in that system about, you need to be kinder, and you need to be gentler, you need to be nicer, you need to be fair, you might as well be in a Peanuts cartoon going, wah, 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 wah. Because it's about as effective as that. Finally, the pleasure and connection process of relationships begins to get compromised. There's actually physiological parts of our system that, when they are downregulated enough, begin to shut off. And if they're suppressed long enough, it will affect our ability to connect to other people. So this is just having this system on and on and on and on and on. This is a problem for us. So essentially what I'm saying is, the more it's used, the more capacity it builds. And where we initially had a relatively small, very acute, very aware sensory, we now have developed super sensory. He's like sensory on steroids on steroids on steroids. So I'm going to move from that and go into the next system, which is, we're going to talk about the polyvagal system. The fire starter, or that survival system, boy, when it gets ignited, and remember, how fast can it get ignited? In about 9 to 10 milliseconds. It's fast. When it becomes activated, it can become activated in two ways. One is that sympathetic, what we call sympathetic dominance, and this is where we have that fight or flight kind of behavior, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. The other side, which is kind of unfortunate for a lot of times, is the dorsal responses. This is the passive withdrawal, the numbing, the disconnection, the dissociation, which are entirely correct physiological responses to having that system activated. Now, which system do people operate in generally is determined by their history of activation. If I'm in an environment where if I am going to fight, it's going to make the whole system just even much more worse, then I probably want to use dorsal. Now, it's not that clear of a choice, it's just a reaction. But if the dorsal may tell me, get out of the way, withdraw, disconnect, to feel safe. These two we often refer to as being the hot system. They are your survival system. Please let go of the fight, flight, or freeze thing, which has pervaded our society. The reality is, you're either going to see somebody engage in sympathetic behavior, or you're going to see them engage in dorsal behavior. So why is that important? If either of those two systems are engaged, you move out of your upper brain into your lower, most primitive parts of your brain, the most reactive parts of your brain. In the triune model, we call that the reptilian or lizard brain. Now, I want you to think, how open to instruction is any lizard that you have ever met? How many of you have ever met a lizard that was just, man, they took instruction well? You could say, I think you need to lead a little different diet than just these bugs. You need to broaden it out, have a more healthy diet, and da-da-da. Did they take that learning and go forth and prosper? No, lizards don't learn very well. When people are in this part of their brain, they don't learn very well. Think about your own experience. How many times have you been dysregulated and had somebody try to instruct you? Did you think it was a good idea? Did you benefit from it in that moment? Did some of you resent it? Did it make you feel defensive or reactive, or you felt like you needed to explain why you were right? Anybody had that kind of experience? That's because it's not the right frame of mind to begin instruction. We have to get people in the upper part of their brain in order to do intentional work of any kind. What is growth? Growth and empowerment are intentional functions. They are not willy-nilly accidental functions. They require the person to take an intentional action and to follow through on it. That is not a lizard brain activity. Make sense? Questions before I move on? Okay. So let's look at what the appropriate physiological behaviors are for being sympathetic. You should be, if you're working with somebody and they are in the survival system, you should see some combination of these behaviors. They should be angry. They should be aggressive. They should be assaultive and hostile. They should be impulsive and irrational. They should be self-centered. That is physiologically correct for this system of operation. They're not in the right part of their brain to do other things, unless it's dorsal, because they may be dorsal. And if they're dorsal, we're going to see these kinds of things pop up. They're going to feel stuck, unable to move forward, kind of a fear of taking any action whatsoever. They're going to dissociate. They're going to numb out. They're going to distract. They're going to self-soothe, which is, we tend to think of things like suicide. We tend to think of things of drug addiction, cutting, as being dorsal behaviors. They're reactive, they're impulsive, and they're going to do a lot to create emotional and psychological distance. And of course, they're self-centered. At the extreme of this, because sometimes what we hear is, well, they're so self-centered, they're narcissistic. So I kind of chuckle at that. I don't really like that definition. But if you think in terms of narcissism, sympathetic is going to be overt narcissism. Dorsal is going to be covert narcissism. It's still all about me. It's just how that comes across to people.
You said that their history will determine which type, what sympathetic or dorsal someone will lean towards. What is it in their history that makes them go one way or the other?
Experience?
Like, are there certain experiences that always lead people to be sympathetic, or? No.
Remember, each person's experience history is unique to them. I can give you an example of some of the things we've seen. In an environment where the child is never hit, but frequently ridiculed, we noticed a particular thing that emerged. It was kind of interesting. The 3-year-old, just by living in this environment, had learned to distinguish car door slams. And when a certain car door slam occurred, she would immediately leave the room and go into her bedroom and shut the door, which is unusual behavior for a 3-year-old. What she had learned to associate that particular sound meant Dad was drunk, and he was going to come in and yell at people. He never hit anybody, but he just said really nasty things to them. Now, where her older brother had a totally different response. Dad would come in, he'd say things, and the brother would be engaging in sympathetic behavior. What do you think he would do? You can't talk to me that way, and he'd get all bristly, and he'd be aggressive, and they'd get into it, which wasn't good for a 9-year-old and a 47-year-old guy to do that, but that's what they would do, which I think created more of an environment for her to want to withdraw from. Does that make sense? It really is unique to the individual. So don't get caught up in trying to figure out what the history is. Look at what you're seeing. If you see somebody that they have lots of choices, and how many of you have had friends that just call every damn person they know before they can make a decision? You know anybody like that? Person's operating dorsally. They are afraid to decide, which tells you they're not regulating very well. If you think about the tones of those conversations, you probably realize they really aren't regulating themselves very well when they're doing that. These are interesting dynamics because on the sympathetic side, we tend to see these as problem behaviors. We tend to see the dorsal as psychiatric problems. While that may be true in the way we organize data in the DSM, the reality is that both of these are completely correct if this threat stress response system is on. The fact that you see these tell you which system the person's operating in. Now, is that a problem? How many of you have tried to get people to do nice cognitive planning, have goals when this is the system they're in? Yeah, not going to work. So let me kind of explain a little bit of why. So at the point of activation, in other words, when the system comes on, there is no longer any future focus. There is no future. It's about this moment in time or what just happened. Is that a problem? How many of you can effectively come up with a behavior management plan or a treatment plan or help somebody grow when in their view of the world, and it's completely physiologically correct, there is no future? I mean, you can say, we're going to do this tomorrow. They're not going to have the ability to tolerate it. Make sense? The other thing that's problematic is that non-essential systems get what we call downregulated. And when they get downregulated enough, they become suppressed systems. And I'm going to kind of go through some of those in a minute, but it's kind of important to understand why this is a problem for us. The other piece that I really want you to kind of get a handle on, and I'm sorry I don't have any nice, easy name for this one. The easiest one is the name it is, which is the medial prefrontal cortex. When the medial prefrontal cortex is operating well, what it's doing is it's integrating all of your experience into some kind of picture, if you will, or what we call gestalt. It's taking all of your experience and integrating it into one picture. And then it does a really nice thing for you. It timestamps it. So it integrates and timestamps your experience. So if I were to ask some of you, I don't know, who went to a movie here in the last 6 months, you could probably walk through what you did, how you got there, what you did before, what you did during, what you did after. And it's a nice integrated experience, and it's nice time set in sequence. The moment of activation, this system comes unglued. What does that mean? You are not grabbing the whole environment, the whole experience. You're going to grab bits and pieces of it, and it's also going to be missing the time stamp. How many of you have worked with somebody and you're hearing their story, and this time they're telling it is different than the last time they told it? And our natural tendency is to go, damn liars, isn't it? The reality is, if the medial prefrontal cortex has been offline during their experience, they know something happened, but they're only remembering a chunk here and a chunk there, and they really can't sequence them very well. So they aren't lying. Every time they tell it, the sequence should change because this system wasn't operational at the time of the thing happening. That's physiology. That's not a crazy person. That's just the way the body is wired to work. Make sense? Now, I will tell you, if you're in a situation where you're frequently activated, what you're going to see is people that have whole periods of their history they can't recall. Whole periods of situations where they're only focused on one piece of it. Why? Because it didn't get encoded and time-stamped. So what are some of the suppressed systems? Did I include this picture in yours? Yeah. Okay. I think that looks like a pretty good job of suppressing. The suppressed systems. So if you want to, let's stand up with me if you can. It's just, we're going to stand up for a second. So we're going to talk about the first system that becomes affected is your subdiaphragmatic system. Okay, you love that term? I'm sorry. What that simply means is everything below your diaphragm is not necessary in the moment of survival, so it gets turned down. What's the problem of turning everything from here down everything from here below, turning it down. You're not going to move as freely, that's sure. What else are you not going to do well? You're not going to digest well. You may have elimination problems. You may have all sorts of secondary health-related risks like diverticulitis, ulcerative colitis, ulcers, blah, blah, blah. But the other piece is the food that you do eat isn't going to be absorbed well nutritionally. So when this system is shut off because it's urgent for you to really be in survival mode, that is perfectly okay. What happens when this system is shut off day after day after day after day because of repeated activations? We start seeing health problems related to this. So it becomes real impactful. Now the next thing, and I'm going to have you do it, kind of like you have your arm around somebody. Can you do this with me? You have your arm around somebody. We're going to call this the relationship. You can scoot closer. She looks like she might be nice. Put your arm around the next. So what happens is the part of the physiology that allows us to experience pleasure from this relationship gets shut down. So what happens when this gets shut down? You don't give a crap about the other relationships all that much. You're not going to read social cues very well. You're not going to be empathic very well, and you're going to have a lot of difficulty regulating yourself. And one of the other pieces with this system is it gives us greater access to our cognitive functioning. So when it's gone, it kind of suppresses that as well. Is that a problem? How many of you want this system impaired? Nope. No one volunteers? Not even in a really messy divorce would you like this system kind of, okay. The final system this isn't really the final, but the one that has the most impact on us in settings of dealing with people is, I want you to do this now. Everything above your eyebrows, shut it off. You want to do that? That's essentially what we're doing when we activate the system. Upper brain, not engaged. So you can sit down. So when these systems get suppressed, it's completely appropriate when that threat stress response system is on. The problem is, if that system is on and on and on and on, then we take a downregulated system and we suppress it. And the body will react to that. Just like the body will react to excitation. When the system comes on, we excite this upper part, don't we? Heart rate, blood flow, breath volume, breath rate. If that stays high, what does our body do to adapt? How many of you know somebody that has hypertension? Well, sure. We just change our standing baseline. That is how the body adapts to these systems being online all the time. So you are dealing with people sometimes that have histories that have put them into a state of constant sympathetic or dorsal activity. They have many suppressed systems. And what do? We expect them to operate in a different system than they're in. Isn't that kind of nuts? So I'm going to kind of move through this. The relational system that I was talking about earlier, your relationship you don't want to lose. The official title for that is the ventral vagal complex. And it is necessary to have this system be active to have any quality of attachment. Did you hear what I just said? So if you have a family where the adults in the family don't know how to have good relationships, or it's a highly chaotic environment, they probably are not going to be able to stabilize the environment well enough for a child to get attached. That's not news to anybody, is it? But we tend to, in some ways, think that there's something intentional on the behavior of the child or the behavior of the person that's not attaching well, that they're choosing to do that. If that system has been dysregulated or downregulated, you don't have adequate access to it. So it should affect your ability to attach and all of your relationships. Now, here's kind of, how many of you, anybody here work with veterans? No? Pardon? Okay. So let me give you an idea of what we see sometimes when working with veterans. They remember what it felt like physically and emotionally to love a family member, a friend, a parent, a child. They remember what it felt like. But because of the impairment that has happened to this system, they can't feel it anymore. And it's very confusing to them. And they begin to ask, well, do I not love them? You know, is there something wrong with me? And they begin to kind of have that kind of a process. And there's a lot of them that just, you know, leave marriages or kind of disconnect themselves from their family because they can't reconcile that difference. And it's a huge problem for us. Does that make sense? So this ventral vagal complex, when I'm explaining this to families, I call it the fuzzy system. When the hot system comes on, the fuzzy system gets suppressed. That's not a good thing. Unless it's really genuinely necessary for survival, you don't want that system on. This is my easy way of explaining it. So I think it makes sense. Just what I said. All right. So I'm going to kind of enumerate some of the problems we have when the fuzzy system is kind of down-regulating. Here we go. Your general feeling of pleasure will be reduced. How many of you have seen that psychiatric label, does not experience pleasure in what was formerly pleasurable? Well, duh. If this system's been down-regulated, that's exactly what you should experience. It doesn't make them a psychiatric case, it makes them dorsally driven. Difficulty relating to others and forming satisfying attachments. If it's gone on long enough, in other words, it started really early in life, you may actually find that it's activating or turns their threat-stress response system on to have somebody try to attach to them. So they both want the attachment and are terrified of it. Does that feel like borderline to you? That's very much what we see. And finally, when the medial prefrontal cortex gets adapted, what ends up happening is you have this system that's supposed to integrate your experience and timestamp it, and there's no relational part there. Even when we get past the original dysregulation, we aren't capturing relationship because we're not experiencing it. So we have a history that does not include the experiences, pleasant experiences around relationships. That's incredibly problematic for us. So I see some people sitting there with kind of these glazed-eyed things. Am I moving too fast for you? I am giving you an awful lot of science. But I think you have to understand this to know what's going on with somebody that's manifesting symptoms. All right. So let's talk about what do you lose when remember we talked about everything above the eyebrows getting shut off? So when the eyebrows and above are active, we're able to do some basic things. We can regulate our bodies. We can have an attuned communication. An attuned communication, the simplest explanation of that is kind of what you all have, at least one or two people in your life, that if you're in a good state and they walk into the room, you can kind of tell what's happened to them. It's almost intuitive. You can tell they've had a good day or a bad day, or if somebody's hurt their feelings. If you're a caregiver and you have a newborn in your home, it doesn't take very long before you attune to them and you recognize the difference between I've got a messy diaper, I've got a wet diaper, I'm hungry, I just want to be picked up and held, kind of cry. Does that make sense? That's an attuned communication. All the attachment literature in the world says good attachment requires attuned communication. You cannot have attuned communication if the VVC is off. The ability to to regulate your emotions, the ability to choose and respond before you react, the ability to relax your body, what we call it's the opposite of the fear response, which is fear modulation. It's release, relax, and restore. That's the opposite effect, if you will, to fight, flight, or freeze. Now, the next ones are kind of important because these are where we expect people to be. We expect them to have empathy. We expect them to have insight. We expect them to have judgment and discernment and be able to evaluate and weigh their own experience. We expect them to use moral awareness, and I'm not talking religiosity here. I'm talking about that they have a value system that they operate within. We expect them to be able to use intuition, and if we're going to be in an environment where there's spiritual feelings, they're in this system, and even a significant part of our identity is tied to this system. Almost all therapy requires people to be in this system in order to benefit from it. If you think about that, most parenting programs require the child to be in this system. Well, it requires the parent first, but then the child to be in this system in order to be parented differently. The problem that we have is at the point of activation, when this other hot system comes on, we lose access to this. So what ends up happening is we put pressure on people to perform in a part of the brain they are not in. That'd be like me randomly walking up to anybody in this room and handing you ballet shoes and say, put them on and let's see a dance. Now, I might occasionally get a winner, but I have more misses than hits with that approach, aren't I? We have to design what we do to be more physiologically friendly. Trauma-sensitive work is about designing the environments of care, and whether that's in a clinic, whether that's in a school, or whether it's in your home, so that we are not activating other people. That usually requires an incredible amount of intentionality on the part of the people in charge of that environment, which means, first and foremost, they need to keep themselves over here, regardless of what's going on in their environment. Ooh. That's just not what we tend to do. We like drama. Human beings love a good drama. How many of you, as adolescents, a friend would have a bad relationship and everybody in the group knew about it and maybe heard about it several times? We love drama. It's actually pretty bad for us, but we love it. Does this make sense? So, what happens? When the system is activated, because of how it affects us individually, and here's the problem, because of how it affects us individually, we begin to adapt individually. It would be so much easier if we said, well, if we swat this kid in the face, he will respond this way, which will create this adaptation. That's not it. It's each person's adaptation is unique to them. That's a tremendous difficulty for us because we want to lump people into groups and say, when this happens, do that. That's how we design everything. Because we don't really want to have to be sensitive to the nuance of the individual. If you're going to work with trauma, you have to become sensitized to the nuance of the individual. Trying to do everything the same for every person is not going to work. So what happens? They begin to adapt. Is there an impact on adaptation? If I'm beginning to adapt, is my behavior going to change? Yeah. So let's say that I've had a situation where that relational system has been suppressed most of my life. And I've been pulled out of a really chaotic environment. I've been put into a relatively stable foster environment. And everybody expects my behavior to go away. The environment here that's trying to connect with me and attach with me may be activating me as bad as the worst thing that happened there. I know it's counterintuitive, but we have to think, we're not thinking from a rational brain, we're thinking from a physiological reality. So when the kids react badly, then we tend to say, well, this is an unmanageable kid, and we really put a lot of energy on blaming the least powerful member of the environment. I'll give you another example. There's a number of folks that do foster and adoption that think it's going to be great. This kid hasn't had anything, they've really suffered, and they plan a big family vacation and they want to take the kid with them. And the kid does a total meltdown the whole time they're at Disneyland. And the parents say, well, you know, why aren't they thankful? Look at all this we're doing for them, and they're just not, look at how they're acting. Well, yeah, they're acting the way they should act because you've actually made them feel less safe than they were before. Part of the trauma sensitivity is viewing the world from the eyes of the other person, not viewing the world from your view and expecting them to see it your way. It's climbing into their skin and seeing the world from their point of view. If you cannot do that, you should probably not be in the profession of dealing with traumatized folks. Now that may sound harsh, but that's probably the nicest way I've said it in months. The environment will begin to react to whatever adaptations are made. If, for example, I gave you an example earlier of the little 3-year-old gal that would run to her room and the car door would slam, and she would hide out in there, and she would sometimes even get under the bed, and she wouldn't talk, and she would just... You think that the environment reacted to that? How many times were her family saying, come out of your room, you know, or, you know, you don't want to be with us, which was one of the things that Mom said. She doesn't want to be a part of our family. No, she wants to be part of the family. She doesn't want to be a part of this dynamic. That's a very different thing. Change the dynamic, she'll come out of the room. But that requires that the people in charge of the environment be regulating themselves and choosing intentionally. And that's the rub. So adaptation is going to occur. Let me put it a different way. Change always happens. We have to ask ourselves, is the change going to be helpful or not helpful? A lot of times that really has to do with which system is in operation. So if I am regulating well, then I'm open to growth and change. And as long as my environment here supports, where's my little, oh, I'm not seeing it. As long as the environment supports my growth, then it's probably going to perpetuate. But what happens when the environment doesn't support my growth? It crashes most people. Most people are not strong enough to overcome their environment. You do realize that, right? How many of you have been in a work environment when you started there, you thought, man, this is cockeyed. In 6 months, you're doing everything like they do it. Well, how did you adapt to that? It's still no more right than it was when you started, but you have adapted to it. We adapt to the environment. This is one of the problems we sometimes see with substance abuse treatments. The person gets into a place where they can regulate themselves, they begin to make choices, they begin to follow through, they begin to move in a forward, growth-producing way, and the environment doesn't support it. They're used to working with this person being addicted or drunk or whatever they are. They aren't used to working with this person that isn't that way. And so the environmental pressures begin to put them back into a state of relapse. Can I ask a question? If somebody has a question, you guys, is your hand up? Because can you make sure that your mics are off? Because I'm hearing paper rustling that's going to be recorded. So just make sure the mic in front of you is off. No light. Okay? Thank you. So if the environment supports, we continue growth. If the environment doesn't support, it's not going to continue. The same is true on the other side. If a person's in their hot system, they're being impulsive and reactive and aggressive and all of those kind of wonderful things, or they're in that dissociative, shutdown, numbing state. If the environment doesn't support that, in other words, the environment is activating relational things with them, it's not going to sustain itself. But the danger is we have a lot of environments that are family cultures that the environment actually excites this process and makes it more dramatic. Is that, are you kind of following that? So the environment either helps you or hurts you. We want to spend all of our focus in therapy and social services on the individual, which is short-sighted. We really need to invest a good amount of energy in stabilizing whatever environment the person's in if we really want to see them improve. Why? Because if that environment doesn't support any changes that they make, they're going to not sustain it. Have we seen that? Yes. Substance abuse programs across the country have a 90% failure rate. People are able to stay sober during the time that they're there. They come out and they relapse. Group homes have had this phenomena for years. Kids do really well in them. They go back to their family and the kid crashes. We've got to stop treating individuals alone and embrace the concept of trauma as an environmental thing. It's not some internal deficit that we possess. It's an internal expression of an environment, and we need to regulate that environment if we want to change this. Now, people say, well, you can't do that. Or you're blaming the parents, or you're blaming the school, or whoever else you want to blame. I'm just telling you what the mechanics of the physiology are. You have to change the environment if you want to stabilize people. Now, for parenting, you know, parents generally have control of that environment. Whether they feel like they do or not, that's a different thing, but they generally do. But having the environment be stabilized is incredibly important to good care for everybody. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I think I'm just trying to synthesize some of it too, because when you were speaking of, say, a child in a foster home and talking about maybe the environment could be positive but still cause a stress response.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, you're kind of talking about both things are equally important. The kind of cool environment, but even within a cool environment, say a hot kid still needs to just be seen. It's the relationship piece. You go back to that. So that two different pieces. Yeah,
Right.
because some of me was trying to wrap my brain around, say, a foster care situation too,
Sure.
on with that a nurturing environment that might be there still causing a stress response. But
Because
it's
if they
allowing
aren't,
them to cool
yeah,
down.
if they aren't used to it,
Right.
then it may actually act as an activating factor. So they try to be nice to me, I'm going to react to it because I don't have familiarity with it. I've never had stimulation in this system. So it's slow. You know, human beings don't just instantly, this just doesn't get activated and it's all fixed in a month. It takes time. It takes being focused on the relationship rather than on all the rules. Now, there are certain things you just can't tolerate because they're not safe for other family members. But a lot of this requires the person that's in charge of that family to think through this process. Because a lot of times we just operate on what's habit for us. For example, how many of you have walked into the room in the middle of a night, turned a light on, and the light goes, pff, and you know, right here, in the core of your being, that light's not going back on. What do? You grab the switch and you do this 3 or 4 times. And then you mumble on your way to wherever you keep your light bulbs. We love habit. And when you bring one of these children into your home, you cannot operate on the habit. You have to do everything you do with them intentionally, with a plan in mind. And that's a lot of work if we're going to stabilize this child. And frankly, there are a lot of people that just want the kid to be easy to get along with. There are people that would rather, I don't know if you kind of comprehend this, but sympathetic behaviors, which are most annoying, are less dangerous. Dorsal behaviors are incredibly dangerous. They disconnect, shut down, self-injure, commit suicide, get addicted. Those are much more dangerous. Yet over and over again in foster care, I've seen people that prefer the kid that's dorsal. Why? Because they're easy to manage. I really have some problems with that. So, good question. Did you get an adequate answer? Okay. So how many of you have had this experience? You've been driving somewhere and in your rearview mirror, police lights come on. Now, I don't care what state you were in before. What state are you in now? You feeling a little concerned? Okay. What do you begin to do? Do you think about where you're going, or do you start thinking about, what did I do? Why is this happening to me? You become historical. Now, if you catch yourself there and regulate yourself pretty well, no problem. If you don't, the next piece of this is you're going to activate a whole bunch of worrisome fantasies. What might that look like? I'm going to get a ticket. This is going to cost me a lot of money. I'm going to be late where I'm going. You add your own personal favorites. One of mine was, I'm yelling at my kids all the time to not speed, and here I'm getting pulled over. That was always good. If you can catch it and regulate yourself up in this point, it doesn't have to go any further. But if it doesn't, and you don't catch yourself, then you're going to probably move into what I call the inner assassin. You know, that inner part of us that we carry around that's awful to us? You're so stupid, you know better than something like that. And most people have a really good one hidden there, in there that comes out in these moments. This is physiologically driven responses. These occur in about 9 milliseconds. Bam, bam, bam. We're just, we're into it. We're also not very logical. Anybody married to somebody in the law enforcement field? Or in law enforcement, or have been? One of the funny things that when I do work for the police departments, they'll chuckle at this part because they'll come up to the window of a car, and the people that are really nervous, they can't talk logically. They can't even enunciate well. They stumble over it. They tell you too much. They don't tell you enough. Huh? It's called blah, 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 blah. Or they try to shoot at you what they think you want to hear, and they don't. There's no logic to it. It's messy and generally not very sequential. It's just kind of when that system is activated, that's appropriate behavior. So these are some of the other things that happen at those moments. And you've probably all experienced this. This is natural human stuff. How many of you have had your own language ability kind of slide away from you in a moment when you were irritated or your system was aroused? How many of you have realized that when you're in this state of arousal, you make some of your poorest choices? You want me to see how many people want to raise their hand on that one? How many of you forget all about your value system when you're really upset about something? One of the funniest ones that I had an opportunity to play with is we had a fairly conservative, fundamental religious family that came in, and the two older boys could dysregulate mom, and generally she was sweet and calm and nice and would never say a bad thing. But 10 minutes with her boys, and she was swearing like a sailor at them, and she would be, afterwards she'd be like, because we videotape everything, and she'd see that and she'd go, oh, I'm going to hell. Well, only if you are dysregulated when you die. We begin to react to perceptions than what really is going on. How many of you work with a computer at work? Sits on your desk. Okay. So today is Wednesday. You go into work tomorrow, and on your computer there is a lovely little post-it note that says, come see me when you get in, signed by your boss. You beginning to create worrisome fantasies? Or you get home today and in the mail there is a letter from the IRS collection department. You may even be addressed to the wrong person, just being from there, beginning to create some fantasies for yourself. This is just a human response to having the system activated. And we tend to pathologize clients, we tend to pathologize children, we tend to blame people because this is their system that they're operating in. So let me kind of make it as simple as I possibly can. How many of you have had a really bad sunburn at some point in your life? Who didn't raise their hand about a sunburn? Okay. I've had places where I don't get anything for sunburns or blisters, and so then I have to be more creative. So, but sunburn's going to work for everybody. So, by a show of hands, how many of you, as soon as you realized you're really sunburned and you're hurting, would run home, turn on the hot shower, get your loofah out, and begin to go to work? Anybody? No masochistic tendencies here. Okay. Why wouldn't you do that? It would hurt. What would you do instead? You put aloe vera on it. You might decide to be hygiene optional for a couple of days. Okay? So, you're going to go home and wear the tightest, scratchiest clothing you can possibly find? Nope. Loose, soft, smooth stuff. Okay? You're going to put aloe vera on it? I heard somebody say they're going to put aloe vera on it. What you've engaged in is an adaptation cycle generated by pain. What did you do? You had an ouch, and you began to do things to make it hurt less. You began to avoid. How many of you would run back out in the sun? Or take that hot bath or that hot shower? No, you're going to avoid things that are going to have the danger of poking your sunburn. How many of you are going to really welcome someone coming up and poking you? Anybody? No one? This is really funny. I was in Dallas, and one of the participants in this workshop was saying, well, if I was had a sunburn, I would just, because she had 4 children and the oldest was 9. So that seemed like pretty close to me, but that's just me. I said, so you have a 3-year-old. The 3-year-old comes running up to you. What are you going to say to the 3-year-old? And she's going to say, she said, well, I would tell him, please don't touch Mommy because Mommy has a sunburn. And I said, you're lying. This is what it would sound like. Don't touch me! And she started to laugh because a few months before, they had actually been down on the coast, and she'd gotten a bad sunburn, and she'd been kind of barking and being nasty to all the kids for a couple of days because they would come up and hug her, and it would hurt. That's just normal. That's not pathology, folks. That's the way our physiology is designed to work. So let me kind of give you another look at this. How much of addiction out there is really people putting aloe vera on the psychological and emotional sunburns that they have acquired? That it's their way to try to deal with the pain of what they've experienced. We certainly know that things like obsessive behaviors like cutting fall into that category, don't they? Yes, they do. It's not crazy behavior. It is correct, physiologically driven behavior for the system in which they are operating. I'm going to move through this because we've kind of been through this adaptation cycle once before. So what do we see when when they are engaging in environments that are traumagenic? We should start to see all of these behaviors. How many of the people that you work with, regardless of what the situation is, whether you're a foster parent or whether you're a clinician or you're a case manager or you're a school teacher, how many of the folks you work with are you seeing these behaviors on a pretty active basis? Pretty much? If you're seeing them, they're in this system, which tells you what? They are not ready to learn. They're not ready to be instructed. They're not ready to weigh and evaluate. And to do so is going to put more pressure on them and tend to make this system worse. Now, nobody really likes to hear that because we want to be able to say, well, that behavior, that's a problem. We need to focus on the behavior. The behavior is never the problem. The behavior is exactly correct. The problem is the environment isn't regulated well enough to not make that behavior consistently unnecessary. It's so much nicer to say that person's engaging in bad behavior. They're a bad person. And it preserves our sense of rightness in the world. So here's the point I'm trying to make. If your alarm system has been on a lot, then the correct behaviors are sympathetic and dorsal behaviors. They are physiologically correct. It doesn't matter how annoying you find them. It doesn't matter how illegal they are. It doesn't matter how immoral they might be. It doesn't matter how much we judge them in society. They are physiologically the correct behavior. And until we can help people get out of that alarm system, we are not going to get a very good outcome with them. Now, what else can trigger actual threat? How about unmet basic needs? These are not a complete list. This is just a partial list. But how many of you have made mistakes trying to appear competent to somebody else? How many of you have felt fear because you are worried somebody wouldn't see you as competent? How many of you have worked with CPS families? How many of those parents are terrified that we are going to see them as not being competent or capable? And we see what from them? Sympathetic or dorsal behaviors. They either get aggressive and hostile and nasty and refuse to do what they're supposed to, or they shut down, withdraw, disconnect, and numb out. Why? Because we, in our wisdom, poked them right in the sunburn. And then we said, they're just damn uncooperative. They're non-compliant. That is BS. The approach we used is an activating approach. We're working in Maricopa County right now with a number of judges in the juvenile justice system to make it a trauma-sensitive juvenile justice system. And it's a lot of work. We're into our second month of working on it. We figure it'll only take us 3 or 4 years. But it's interesting to start talking to judges about how to work with people without being punitive, how to stay away from poking their sunburns, and actually have them have those kind of conversations. It's been really interesting. So what happens when you have an unmet need for very long? It generates fears. Is fear going to help us feel more regulated or less? How many of you are in top performance when you're really scared? So what I have here is a little video, and it's just showing how active the nerve fibers are in the brain. We'll show this again in slow motion. So the nerve is incredibly active and trying to connect. Do you see any filter? Do you see any judge? Do you see any quality assurance feature there? Or is it just connecting based on experience? That's right. It just connects based on experience, which means your experience is wiring your brain. Now what happens when you have similar repetitive activations over and over and over again? You develop neural networks of how to see this stuff. And that's problematic. What does it mean when you have a neural network? It means we've wired the brain to think, to perceive, to react in certain ways. They will not see it otherwise. Just like you don't automatically see the world differently than how you see it. And people sometimes say to me, well, can't they see how bad this is for them? So here's my question for you. If you've ever asked that question, I'm going to assume that you start your day like this. Ready? If you've ever asked that question, ask yourself, do I start my day like this? Here's my day. I get up, and the first thing I do is question the reason behind and the rationality behind every single thing I do. Why I put my left sock on first, why my right pant leg, why every little thing I do, and immediately discard those things that are not reasonable in logic and substitute something that is. How many of you start your day like that? And yet, that's kind of what we're asking people that are operating on their wired-in system. Because we see problems in it, we are critical of them for not seeing the problem in it. The reality is their history has made them behave in the way they behave, just as your history, what you're basically grousing about, is that they don't comply with your history. Oh, boo-hoo. They have their own history. We have to be able to step into that in order to help them. Is that we're really good at wanting people to step towards us, to come the way we think is right. And the moment we put that pressure on somebody, we are in danger of dysregulating them. So, would you be surprised that I would say that the most efficient learning you do is cellularly? Let me give you an example. How many people in this room have had a vaccination? Okay. So with a vaccination, what do? We introduce a dead or weakened strain of something into your system. And what does your body learn to do pretty quickly? Build antibodies. Recognize it as an enemy and attack it. How many exposures does it take? Generally 1. Rabies, it takes 4. Okay. But most people are doing the rabies thing. 1 exposure. Isn't that incredibly efficient learning? So what is the body of a person learning that is activated over and over and over and over again many times every day? The body is learning. And what it's learning is natural and perceptual, the way that they see the world. We have to step away from being so critical and evaluative of their view of the world, because their view of the world is correct for them. Whether it's illegal or immoral or isn't socially acceptable is not the question. So even genetics are affected by this. I'm going to show this little clip.
DNA contains the instructions for building all the parts of the body. But DNA is only half the story. The DNA in our bodies is wrapped around proteins called histones. Both the DNA and histones are covered with chemical tags. This second layer of structure is called the epigenome. The epigenome shapes the physical structure of the genome. It tightly wraps inactive genes, making them unreadable. It relaxes active genes, making them easily accessible. Different sets of genes are active in different cell types. The DNA code remains fixed for life, but the epigenome is flexible. Epigenetic tags react to signals from the outside world, such as diet and stress.
So, how impactful is diet and stress on your genetics? You're born with a blueprint book about yay thick. But which of those things get built have a lot to do with the environment that you're in. And what we have at this point and it's a budding research field. The genomic science field is really relatively new. But in genomic science, we've realized now that there are at least 30,000 genetic switches affected by stress. What does that mean? That it can be turned on, turned off, turned up, or turned down. This is a problem because some of those adaptive processes create tremendous difficulty for people. For example, 2004, this one was published. There's been a lot of research around it since then, where it talked about that exposing people to repeated exposure to stress can affect the body's developing ability to transport and absorb dopamine or serotonin. What does that mean? that system can be switched off. If the environment is an activating environment, if it turns down or shuts off your transport system, what's going to happen? You, by your nature, are going to be more reactive, more emotional, more impulsive, more hostile. You're just going to not be calm. Is the environment going to react to you? The environment is going to react to you. However, how many of you, through an active will of consciousness, can change your own genetic material? How many of you can even change your liver function? You know, let's just do it for a second. Think really hard about your liver not working the next 20 seconds. Can you do that? Of course not. We don't have any control over that level of our physiology. But the environment is provoking these kinds of changes. And the scary part is, the research is beginning to indicate that these changes get inherited to the next generation. I hope you understand what I'm saying with that. It is becoming increasingly important to help us understand trauma that we have to regulate the environment. We have to help people regulate the environments for optimal health and mental health. Why? A dysregulated environment is going to have these kinds of genetic effects. Another one that's kind of problematic is this one. I picked it because it relates to what's going on in our country right now. The alpha-2 delta-1 protein gets restricted. And when it gets restricted, it sends a signal to a part of the brain called the diencephalon. You don't need to worry about that. Call it the energy czar of the body. Its job is to make sure you have adequate energy for survival. That's its job. And what happens when you're in survival mode and that protein gets shut down is it tells your body you better start accruing some energy. Well, how are we gathering energy as human beings? We intake calories, don't we? So here's what the adaptation. The environment activates this change and tells the brain to consume high-calorie, high-fat foods, and oh, by the way, turn down your thermogenic engine so you don't burn it up. Is there a problem with that? Obesity, blood sugar disorders of all kinds, and a number of other issues. What's interesting to me is how much energy we have spent in the last 6 years or so in repackaging the food charts and trying to get good foods in schools. And a lot of those good foods in schools are gone uneaten. The kids just throw them away. When you look at children that are obese and you do a biopsychosocial history that's focused on trauma, you will find most of them have 4 or more traumatic events. And they usually started very early in life, usually before the age of 2. This is incredible that we are spending a fortune on trying to say it's a choice of these children to be obese, rather than it's a consequence of the environment that these children are operating in that is activating them and activating them and activating them and created this shift. Now, how many of you in a moment of stress have craved a piece of chocolate? Is that unusual for people? No, because when you're in survival mode, this system gets kind of impaired. And it tells you to do what? Consume calories. Candy happens to be a really good way to do that. That doesn't make you abnormal. But when your system is compromised all the time, your body adjusts by just changing your genetics. Yeah, you're always going to want this stuff. No other foods are really going to appeal to you. You understand how that can be problematic. But what happens is the environment reacts to these people that are obese. How does the environment react? We tend to blame the obese person. We tend to see it as a character flaw, a choice, poor control, poor willpower. Let me just say this. There isn't anybody in here that is strong enough. Well, there aren't very many people. I guess Gandhi was one, but very few people can set aside a biological imperative. For example, we have a biological imperative to drink water. Now, you may get by without it for a few days, but eventually your body's going to be screaming for it, isn't it? And if you don't get it, your body shuts down, begins to shut down. We create a biological imperative when this system gets compromised. And the biological imperative is to consume and retain calories. It's not a good bad. It's an unfortunate thing. There's some health complications, but it has nothing to do with the person, generally their willpower, the way we normally look at it. Well, if they would just be stronger of a person, they wouldn't have this. That's BS. They aren't operating on what we know about physiology. So here's some basic assumptions, and then I'm going to run through a case with you so you can kind of get a feel for how to apply this. People are acting exactly as their history has wired them to act, perceive, to think, to emote. Poor and problematic behavior is a consequence of a reactive adaptation. Poor or problematic behavior is also evidence that the sympathetic or dorsal system is on. Growth and change require intentional, consistent use of the cool system or your executive functioning system. You don't get growth, intentional growth, without being able to be in that system. And behavior should never be the starting point of either parenting or a therapy approach, unless it's an immediate threat to life. Why? Because the behavior you're seeing is exactly correct physiologically. Don't attack the behavior. If you attack the behavior before you've got the person regulated and in their cool system and being able to think logically, it's like swimming out to a tired swimmer who has this one flotation device and they have cramps and they're having difficulty staying afloat, and you're trying to take it away from them. You're in for a fight. Why? Because they need it. It is physiologically correct. Now, do people like hearing that? No, because annoying behaviors we want to go away. We want them to go away yesterday. We don't have to deal with them. The reality is, the way to get them to go away is to help the person climb out of this system. So let me kind of walk you through. I'm going to skip a couple slides here. And go, what? Somebody have a question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
For an immediate problem solving for the stress reaction, where when the person or child is in having a problem with the stress reaction, and they're angry and they're yelling and screaming, and is it okay for an immediate calm down period to occur where they can sit by themselves for, say, 15 or 20 minutes
to
calm down?
So you're looking at like a timeout?
No, they request it.
If they request it, go ahead and give it to them. But generally, we encourage people that are working with traumatized children not to use timeouts, because they already have, what's this system that's gone? Timeout just plays into this system being gone.
So it would
what we would suggest instead is for the person that's the caregiver to regulate themselves incredibly well so that they are calm, that they are not getting upset, and to sit with this child and speak in a calm voice. If that's difficult to imagine how you would talk to a pet. Don't talk to the kid like a pet, but use the same tonal qualities and just sit with them. Don't require any interaction from them. Just sit with them and tell them how you appreciate them and you're glad that they're here. Now, what some people say, well, you're just rewarding them for all this bad behavior. You cannot correct the bad behavior without an adequate relationship to support any discipline you do. So what we want to do is get the behavior before we have the adequate relationship. So you always want to move, particularly with foster and adoptive kids, you want to move relationally. And you want to orchestrate it as much as possible. That when something is going on, that look, I'm going to sit here with you, we're going to get through this, it's going to be okay. This may seem awful, this may remind you of other things, but we are letting go. We're going to stay right here with you while you go through this.
So a timeout system is not a good idea.
I would not suggest a timeout, because what you're doing is you're really reinforcing that they should be more dorsal. And really, what you want, you don't want a kid that's dorsal. You want them to be as sympathetic as possible. Now, it's more of a headache for you, but the dorsal is much more dangerous. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I would rather sit there with them for a while, and sometimes it may take 20, 30 minutes. And a lot of people say, I don't have time to do that. Well, then you need to arrange your environment differently, or maybe this isn't the right fit for you to have kids with that level of dysregulation. And you don't know until you get them in your home a lot of times. Let's be honest. Anybody here CPS workers? Because I'm going to beat on a CPS worker for a minute. The DCS, we'll call them the newer, friendlier version of CPS. They don't give you much history. They don't prepare you for what's walking in the door. And you learn that from working with the kid. And sometimes kids have been dysregulated almost from day one. And so for them to develop a sense of safety in any environment, you're talking about months per year of age. And when you start talking in terms like that, I've had people say, well, how long should it be? Well, I said, well, somewhere between 3 to 9 months per year of age. I wouldn't suggest it ever going to be less than 3 months per year of age for a single behavior to go away. So you get a 5-year-old, you're looking at 15 to 45 months. No foster parent on the face of the planet wants to hear that, but that's the reality. If we're going to create an environment, it's slow. Think about what we trade on in our own families. We spend the first 2 years building relationships with this child. We change their diapers, we feed them, we hug them, we play with them. We don't require them to do anything. We're just relating to them. And then it's as they move past into the terrible twos, we begin more instruction, but the instruction is really interspersed with what? Ongoing relationship. It doesn't matter if you have a 7-year-old. They need that same time to form that attachment, to change that behavior. Does that help? The first and foremost piece, and we call this the first 4 essential interventions, is the person of the caregiver must be able to regulate themselves. In other words, you have to keep you out of the threat response system. You cannot effectively deal with people that are traumatized if you're climbing into the dysregulation after them. You have to stay out of that system. You have to, second, create an environment that doesn't poke people's sunburns. And that is going to be different for each person that you work with. Now that's really unfortunate because we'd like to say, well, this worked with this person, so it's going to work with everybody. No, not so much. Third one, you're going to have to help them regulate with you first. And here's what I see with foster parents. A lot of times the kid's with a parent, the kid can talk about something, they seem to know what's going on, and the parent leaves and the kid goes and does the very thing the parent and they agreed to that kid wouldn't do. And the foster parents or adoptive parents see that as a failure. It's not. It's a stage in the process. They have to learn to regulate while they're with you before they can make the transition to regulating when they aren't with you. So, yes, they'll agree with you and they'll go along with you and they'll talk about it and then they'll go right out and do the very thing you've agreed that they're not going to do. That is correct. Unpleasant, unfortunate, but it's correct. These are the first 4 things that we have to help people do a better job of. No parenting program will work well if you cannot do these 4 things well. Also, most parenting programs are designed for parents and children that are not in a dysregulated state. Is that enough of an answer to your question? Okay.
I have a family also that is wanting to foster. We already have an ADHD boy that is their biological son.
Mm-hmm.
They're wanting a closer child
Of course they do.
as their foster. And they're wanting my advice as to what kind of a child to adopt. And should they adopt that type of a child? And I'm going, I really don't know. It's really going to depend on,
What's your role with them?
I'm just pretty much a friend.
Okay.
You know, and
Well, I will say something to you as the friend that I would probably be more aggressive about this with a professional that's actually working with them. If you have a kid with ADHD in a family, you need to do a trauma screen on that family. You're not looking for events, you're looking for this frequent activation in this environment. Why? Because ADHD only occurs naturally, organically, about 2% of the time. And we have almost 40% of school-age kids diagnosed. And the symptoms of ADHD are very sympathetic system consistent. So if I see somebody that has an ADHD kid, before I would ever put a kid in that environment, I'd want to assess the family dynamics, and more than just do they have adequate food, shelter, clothing, do they have access to care, good transportation, because what people are used to looking at is, well, is the kid's going to be abused here? Are they going to be safe? Well, physical safety, if we broaden it out, can take in a lot that we aren't currently considering, because those high frequency, low intensity activations create just as severe symptoms as the big events, and they're more common in an everyday family life. So, just the alarm bell would go off in my head that if you have an ADHD child, you probably shouldn't foster, especially if you haven't done a good screening on the family. And of course, if the family is at all sympathetic, if the parents are at all sympathetic, and they're your friends, so you would know probably, if they're at all sympathetic, they are not going to be open to the idea of anybody really looking at their family very closely.
well, they are working with CPS
But CPS doesn't look at these things.
and with the Department of Security.
Also doesn't look at these things. They just want to get the kid placed.
I believe they're going to get a child.
They may. So as a friend, you might just want to say, I don't think it's a very good idea. So, whereas I would say, don't do it without a really good screening.
Requesting babysit.
I'm trying to be mindful of our time, so I'm going to move past this. Thank you. We talked a little bit ago about how if you move people into that reptilian brain, you're not going to get good responses. You have to get them up in the cool part to get really healthy relationships and executive functioning. So I'm going to move a little bit here to this case, because I want you to kind of have a way to look at this. It's a little different. So in 2004, we worked with a gal that was referred to us because she broke her boss's jaw with I call it a menudo spoon. Those big metal spoons you stir those big pots with? Some of you do, some of you don't. But the metal spoon weighs about 3 pounds. She hit him upside the head and broke his jaw. And of course, went through the process of being prosecuted for assault with a deadly weapon and some other problems. And so part of her plea agreement was so much probation, and then she would get out and have to go to counseling for 6 months. She actually worked with us for 10 months, but in the meantime, this is what we got in files for her. And this is kind of a summary. She'd been diagnosed as being bipolar since she was about 19. She had been in repeated trouble with the law. She'd assaulted a number of people. She'd been arrested for assaultive behavior on 4 different occasions. Frequent job changes, never very long at any job, arrested for prostitution several times. You know, while she's kind of an equal opportunity substance abuser. Anything she could get her hands on, she would try, including medications for mood stabilization, which was kind of interesting. She also was impulsive in being in relationships. Generally, her longest relationships were about a month long, from beginning to end. She frequently dissociated, lost track of time and place. She would hide food wherever she knew she was going to be going. She would sleep with clothes on at night rather than in sleeping wear. She would kind of alternate between being this perky, happy face and just kind of blow your hair back, hostile. So she comes into the office for the first time. There's another family that's in the office because we primarily focus on family treatment. And one of them happened to say something to her. We're not sure what it was, but she picked up a chair and threw it through the window. That was her first visit to the office. Interesting gal. So these are pretty awful behaviors, but they're not really surprising. In any kind of community behavioral health setting, you see clients that have this kind of presentation or worse. We tend to put a lot of meaning on these diagnoses that she had. So let me kind of give you her history and see if her history does something to help you make sense of what she was doing. She was in therapy 6 times. Things just kept getting worse. She didn't have any real relationships. And this is probably why. From birth to 6, she lived with her parents in a tenement in Russia that had no running water and sporadic electricity and no refrigerator. When she was 5, her baby sister died of hyperthermia sleeping next to her on the floor, which is kind of awful. She never had enough food to eat. She had no regular routines. She was scouring the neighborhood for 6, 7 blocks away from where she lived, going through trashes looking for food. And of course, when she found food, she didn't run home and share it. She ate all she could eat, and then she would drag the rest and hide it somewhere. Several times a month, either mom or dad or both were physically assaulted with each other, sometimes with her. When dad was drunk, when she was 5, started molesting her, which went on for several months until mom caught them at it, at which time mom grabbed the girl and threw her through a 4-story window, because of course it was her fault. She landed on a partial roof, a couple stories down, broke her arm in a couple of places, but didn't die. She was also molested by a neighbor from 0 to 6, and by the time she was 6, she had learned that she could trade sex for food. From 6 to 10, she was in the orphanage system in Russia. That's not a very good system. I don't know if any of you really know much about that system, but to say it's awful is being kind. It is an awful system. So in that system, she had been primarily illiterate when she went into it. By the time she was out at 10, when she was adopted at 10, she was still primarily illiterate. And she was in that system. She was beat up by older kids. She had things that she thought were important to her stolen. And this was the condition she was living in when a minister and his wife and 19 families from that congregation decided to go over to Russia and adopt a bunch of kids to save them. An interesting idea. So they ended up, the 19 families adopted 22 children, and over half of those adoptions, I happen to know from other things, over half of those adoptions ended within 4 years of coming back to the States, but that's neither here nor there. Her parents hung on to her until she was 18. However, she was brought to a country that wasn't her own, that spoke a language she didn't know, And relatively quickly, she was punished for not speaking that language she didn't know. Of course, she was illiterate in her primary language, which meant she's not literate in English, and they punished her for not being very good in school. And her dad would do things like this: call her up in front of the congregation, because he's, the minister, call her up in front of the congregation and ask her to read scripture in front of everybody when she got bad grades. Now, this did not endear her to two things: reading, dad, and religion in general. A lot of conflict over school, performance. The parents were incredibly embarrassed that she didn't speak English well, she didn't do well in school, she didn't want to have anything to do with their religion, as you might guess. They used embarrassment and ridicule as the primary tool of working with this child. The younger siblings were allowed to make fun of her, to heckle her, and they didn't and never had wanted a sister when the child was brought home. Also, the expectations that Dad had that they were going to adopt this child and show the whole congregation that how wonderful he was because they had saved this child wasn't going his way either. The entire level of conflict just escalated. At 18, they kicked her out. So I'm not going to give you any more history, but it goes on like this. So let me ask you this question. Let's review the timeline. I'll ask you questions. So this is her history. Did you capture this stuff as we went through here? Can you all see that from where you're at? So what would be reasonable for any intelligent human being? I'm going to move through these real quick. What would be reasonable for any human being that has had that kind of history to come to believe is true about themselves? To believe is true about relationships. To believe is true about the world at large. Do you think she had some pretty large concerns, or what we might call sunburns? Some of her sunburns were that people will think she's stupid, that people will only want me for sex, that I'm going to be lonely forever. Do these make sense from her history? People will use you, then they'll throw you away. That the world is a dangerous place and it's out to get you. She has evidence in her history of all of that being absolutely true. And she interacted with the world as if that was the truth. Why? Because it is her truth. So let's kind of put this in perspective. What do you think her number one sunburn was? A lot of people think it's the sexual abuse. Her number one sunburn was the fear of being humiliated by people discovering that she was illiterate. Number one sunburn. May not make sense to you, but that was hers. So what did the boss do? The boss had told her once before how to do this thing. She'd done it mostly right, but she'd made a mistake. He wasn't regulating himself very well. So he took the instruction manual and tossed it at her and said, read this and do it the right way. Did he poke her sunburn? What was she terrified was going to happen? People were going to discover she was illiterate. Did she have a completely illegal but correct physiological response? Was it a sympathetic or a dorsal response? Sympathetic response. She picked up a spoon and hit him upside the head. She never had to let him know she was illiterate. A lot of times the behaviors we see that are problematic are like that. They are addressing a sunburn. Do not try to take the behaviors away without addressing the sunburn first. That's problematic. And all you're going to do is panic the person and make them more dysregulated. Now, in this particular case, after a couple of months of working with the therapists here in the clinic, she began to kind of see her own self as being kind of strong. She said things like, you know, I've gotten through everything that's ever happened to me. I can probably get through everything that's coming my way. Does she have evidence for that? You bet. She's been very durable. It's really interesting because everybody that knew her said she's crazy, she's never going to go anywhere, she's never going to do anything with herself, she's, you know, borderline, she's bipolar, she's lots and lots of judgments. Because the behavior was annoying, they became critical, they became reactive to her. When she was around people that weren't that way, and she was able to regulate herself a little bit, she began to grow. So she was with us about 10 months total. The last couple of months, she decided that she wasn't going to let this illiteracy beat her, that she could choose. So she started doing, first she started just telling people in the office, and then she started telling people that she was in contact with. So she decided she needed a job, part of her term of probation. She started telling people, you know, I can't read and write. I'm illiterate. And of course, she has a really strong Russian accent, so they weren't really surprised. Most people were really encouraging to her, which surprised her. They didn't judge, they didn't embarrass her, they just said, well, you know, you need to be able to read to do this job, but you keep at it, you'll find something. And she did. She found a woman that said, well, that's okay, we can work around it. So she started working. In the last 2 months she was in therapy, she was working for that lady. We didn't know how long it would last, but we do a 1-year follow-up at the completion of treatment. At the year follow-up, she was still working for that lady. She'd also made another decision. So we're talking about early 2005. She'd made a decision that she wasn't going to let this beat her, and she'd enrolled in a number of remedial courses, I mean, really basic courses. And that was really, we said, you know, this is a win. She's working, she's not getting into trouble, she's regulating herself, she's actually decided she's going to learn how to read and write. And that was the last contact we had with her until 2012. In 2012, we ran into her at a conference in Albuquerque. Took her almost 7 years, almost 6.5 years to get her bachelor's. And she was a few months away from graduating from a fast-track master's program. And she was working for an organization that rescues children, girls mostly, from trafficking. Guess what? No psychiatric symptoms. No borderline, no bipolar, no medications. Wasn't interested in getting married and having those kind of relationships, but she had friends, and she'd had the same set of friends for 4 or 5 years. Being productive, being happy, getting ready to buy her own home. We so often sell people short because we do not have the skills to help them get in the right frame of mind to benefit from all the things we can help them do. And really, we don't teach that in schools. We teach therapy models. And most, most organizations' orientations, are all about services and delivering services. We spend very little time talking about how do we help prepare the soil so that the people can really benefit from what we have to offer. We operate on what I call the Jack and the Beanstalk mentality. We're going to go throw magic beans in the backyard and expect to have this huge, lush vine grow to the heavens overnight. And there's a treasure up there, we know. And it's ludicrous because we don't do the basic stuff of laying the groundwork, plotting it out, preparing the soil, making sure it has adequate water and nutrition, keeping the weeds out, making sure that everything that is there that's necessary to have a harvest is done. We want to deal with a behavior rather than prepare people to be successful. And I think that's a shortfall of how we look at services across the board: education, child protective services and foster care, mental health, certainly in my field of psychology. It is a short sight. Mike, please.
Yeah, I turned it on.
Okay.
Do you feel that her bipolar was just a misdiagnosis?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you feel that,
Well, remember what I said earlier about the diagnosis in there, in the DSM? Most of it's a shuck and jive kind of thing.
yeah, well, but do you believe there is a physiological reason for being bipolar when it does occur? Okay, so.
But a very small percentage. Maybe 1.5% of the population could be that at any one time. We have 11% of school-age children diagnosed that way. We have almost 30% of people in the adult mental health system diagnosed that way. It's impossible. It's impossible.
And so do you feel that trauma is the reason why they're exhibiting bipolar?
Let me answer that in a different way. Pull out a DSM, look through the symptoms, and see how many times we are pathologizing sympathetic and dorsal behaviors. So yes, I think most of what we see is a consequence of the traumatic histories people have. And that what we're seeing are completely reasonable physiological adaptations to that history. That doesn't make anybody very comfortable, because we want to put a label on it and say, you got this, give them a pill, send them home, they'll be okay. And this doesn't work very well. So thank you. So this is a little different perspective on the whole world of trauma. So I'm going to move to, in the example of the gal there that I went through with you, was her life full of environmental activators? Just do this with me. Yes, it was. Okay. Did they cause her to shift and adapt in all of these ways, physiologically, behaviorally, blah, blah, blah? Did she see the world in a unique way? Yes, she did. While those adaptations helped her survive, were they good for her life? You know, she'd been arrested a number of times. So they weren't good for her life, but they were predictable. They were reasonable with her history. And was the environment reacting in a rather negative way towards her adaptations? Yep. We are so often dealing with people that have had this kind of experience, and we just want to deal with that overt, annoying thing rather than really put the effort in to establishing a foundation from which they can grow. We just want the bad behavior to go away, and we invest very little energy into let's having them grow. And the absence of a negative doesn't mean a positive is going to jump up in its place. That requires us to be intentional in the way we do things. So I'm going to pop back to our essentials. The person of the therapist or helper, whatever your role is, you must be able to regulate your own threat stress response system. You must be able to create an environment of felt safety, one that allows people to be safe enough to begin the process to regulate themselves. You have to expect that the person's going to have to be able to regulate with you first. Don't expect them to regulate out there first. They'll regulate with you first, and then when they've got that down and can do it pretty consistently, now they're ready to be able to start regulating themselves out there. For those of you that are in the foster adoption world, it's a very similar list. The parent or caregiver must regulate themselves. They have to be able to stay in their own executive functioning or cool system. They have to be able to create an environment that isn't activating that reptile brain. We need, that reptile brain's been alive and well and just used and used and used and used, and it looks like the Incredible Hulk. We really need it to look like an average person. We need to regulate the child relationally. love and relationship before rules and performance. And finally, to help children regulate themselves when they are not in our presence. That is irrational to expect of any child younger than about 11 anyway. Why? In order to achieve that, they have to have a fully functioning hippocampus. The hippocampus starts to develop around 18 months, and it finishes developing in most people somewhere between 10 and 12. Don't expect a child to be able to regulate consistently outside of your presence until they start moving into their teenage years, and then only if they have a good, steady relationship with you. All right, we have about 10 minutes for questions before the people in there turn off the recording. Any questions from you in the back, from the very, very back? Okay. Mm-hmm. Sure. True. I know a few people up here, but my base is actually in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And some of the stuff that's internationally, because I am part of the international organization, so we have some UN contacts, but that won't do you any good. But part of this is really kind of helping people understand what they're dealing with. If I've got a parent that has that kind of history, going through something like this will normalize a lot of what they're doing and help them say, okay, but now that you know, what you need to learn is how to, let's not worry about any of the parenting stuff right now. Let's worry about you learning to regulate you. Because if you can regulate you, you'll be a so much better parent, regardless of what parenting strategies you use. So it's actually in some ways simpler. Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that's the way we've structured the systems of care. That's why it's a huge initiative across the country to be trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive, is because we realize that almost no system that deals with human beings actually functions in a way that's healthy for human beings. And so that's kind of a problem. We want people to fit into, you know, what makes economic reason or what fits with our timelines and our processes, rather than the other end is you deal with an individual. There's a lot of lip service about we do this individualized work, but it doesn't. That's not how it's organized. So what I would suggest is if you have any inclination to see this change, become involved in the politics of mental health in Arizona. You know, become an advocate and an activist, because that's how the changes that have occurred have happened, and that's how they will continue to happen. Good question. Yes, ma'am. Be loud, please, or use your mic.
Sometimes they have a really long waiting list, but Northland Family Help Center has free counseling for anybody that's had trauma.
So you have resources in the room. Good. Any other questions? So, okay, you find it. We got another one back here. Go ahead.
I was just wondering what the resource, I hadn't heard about the stats on the ADHD. that you had quoted, about 40% of children with that diagnosis, but naturally occurring,
The
you said in...
Department of Health, no, sorry, Department of Education posts that every couple of years. So you can get the statistics on, because they collect that data because it creates problems for them in schools. So they can tell you how many people are bipolar, how many are ADHD, how many have learning disabilities. That's where that data is available.
And the naturally occurring piece of it?
That's just biology and genetics. So, you know, we know that if I say the word phenotypic, do you know what I mean? Okay. There are certain elements in us that if they change at a significant percentage, it changes the phenotype of our genetics and it becomes a dominant feature. So, you know, that generally isn't happening. On the things that are the most well-researched, it stayed about the same number for years. Like schizophrenia stayed about 2% since we've been doing research on it. It's probably the most well-researched piece of diagnosis that we have. Most of this other stuff is done by clumping sympathetic and dorsal behaviors together and saying it's this. Even how funny that is, in the 3rd edition of the DSM, Robert Spitzer was one of the original authors of that, was really concerned at the direction it was going and wrote in the foreword, this is not meant for diagnosis or reimbursement. It is designed purely as a way to communicate with other professionals. That's not how it's gotten used ever. So don't put overly much value in diagnosis. I used to manage clinics years ago, and back in the day, then this chief clinical officer could refill prescriptions. That's how long ago that was. Why could you do that? Well, because if you knew your psychiatrist, you knew they were going to give these 4 or 5 diagnoses to everybody that walked through the door, and they were going to prescribe this 10 or 12 medications and these dosages. Why? Because you audit their files every month. You see what they're doing. And they have their favorites, and they have their favorite medications and favorite dosages. Everybody knew that. So if it was a weekend and they couldn't get a hold of anybody and the prescription needed to be refilled, they'd call the chief clinical officer and say, is it all right for us to refill this prescription? And you'd say, well, tell me, who's the doc? What's the diagnosis? Oh, yeah, go ahead and fill that prescription. They don't do that anymore because federal Medicaid law changed. But what you'll find is people's diagnosis will change when they change psychiatrists. Because this psychiatrist has 5 or 6 that he likes, and this one has 5 or 6 that they like. And so it's basically a crapshoot. So now, I have a son that is a pediatric psychiatrist who absolutely hates it when I say that. But that doesn't mean it's not true. Okay. All right, folks, it's 5 to 4. I think we're ready to wrap up. Let me just ask a final question for you, and just a raise of hands. For how many of you was this a shift in the meaning of trauma that you walked in with beforehand? Okay? Some of you, this was just what you already knew. Good. So, if you have questions, see those people that didn't raise their hand. Because I don't live up here. And none of my staff do either. So, those people that didn't raise their hand are there in the back. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I will see you next time I'm up this way.